I spent a long time deciding whether to write about this at all. 6 months have passed, and I still wake up in the middle of the night, unable to figure out where I am for the first few seconds, because I keep seeing that tunnel in the darkness of my bedroom. Lyoshka, my younger brother, stopped going down the tunnel altogether after that night. He sold his gear, deleted his tunnel, and got a job as a courier. The man who had been climbing the Neglinka sewer since he was 14, who knew every ventilation shaft from Okhotny Ryad to Park Pobedy, simply upped and gave it up. But I'll try to explain, at least for myself. That Saturday, September 23rd, we were sitting in my kitchen in Kuntsevo, going over the route. On the table, between mugs of cold tea, lay a printout of an old map that Lyoshka had snatched from a Metro Stroy veteran, Grandpa Vasily. This old man was living out his 9th decade in Lyoblino, and his memory was already confusing his grandchildren's names, but he remembered the location of the workings with precision. The diagram was in pencil, on graph paper, so yellowed that the lines were barely legible. But Lyoshka converted it all to digital form and overlaid it on a modern metro map. Look, he pointed at the laptop screen. Here's the Arbatskaya, Ploshchad Revolyutsy section, deep level. And here? His finger moved to the left. A branch line. According to my grandfather, this is a cut from 1938, cut during the second stage of the tunnel and abandoned. It's a dead end about 120 meters long. He says the lining wasn't even finished there, just bare tubing and some concrete. Welded shut? I asked. My grandfather says there used to be a sealed door, but it was dismantled in the 60s when they installed a cable collector nearby. All that's left is a passage, sealed with shields. Maybe they haven't touched it since then. I sipped my cold tea and grimaced. The area around the deep Arbatskaya is, to put it mildly, challenging. Special facilities. Metro 2, D6. Call it what you will. Lyoshka and I were no newbies. Over 10 years of joint excursions, we'd traversed the Neglinka collectors from Trubnaya to its mouth. We also explored the unfinished sections of the Mitino line and descended into the ventilation shafts of the Circle line. We led tours along safe routes: Neglinka, the Filevskaya line, the drainage adits near the Lenin Library. They paid us well, 5,000 rubles per person in groups of 4 or 5 tourists. But that was routine. But the abandoned 1938 cut, that was a whole other level. It's risky, I remarked. If there's a special service nearby, we'll run into a security checkpoint. FSO, a troika, cameras. The entrance isn't through the metro. My brother shook his head. Through the cable duct. I found a hatch on Vozdvizhenka, behind the construction site fence. From there, follow the cable duct about 200 meters southwest, and we'll come out right at this cut. We'll bypass the entire track infrastructure. No cameras, no guards. He spoke confidently, but I saw his right leg swinging slightly under the table. Lyoshka always did that when he was nervous. He'd swing his leg and not notice. Okay, I sighed. Night window, after 1, after 2. Traffic stops at 1:20, but the track workers are still squirming for another 40 minutes. It'll be clear by 2:15. We left the house at 12:30. Standard equipment. Tyvek coveralls over our clothes, rubber waders, Phoenix helmets with 1,600 lumen headlamps, and spare batteries. Each of us had a Baofeng radio in case we got separated, although we never lost each other. A Draeger gas analyzer was a must. Methane or carbon dioxide can accumulate in old workings. A 30-meter rope and carabiners. Lyoshka also carried his GoPro camera on a chest mount. He always filmed, even when he wasn't planning on posting it on his channel. We got to Vozdvizhenka in our own car. We went out a block and walked. The construction site was fenced with corrugated sheet metal, blue, covered with flyers. Lyoshka had scouted out a spot beforehand where one sheet, held on by a single screw, was bending back. We slipped inside, walked through the mud between the sheds, and my brother led me to the hatch. It had an old-style cast-iron lid with the words, Moza Nurgo written on it, pushed aside and covered with a piece of plywood. Someone had already climbed in before us. I went down first. The clamps were rusty, but they held. The depth was about 7 meters. Below, a cable duct, a rectangular concrete passage about 2 by 2 meters, with bundles of lead-sheathed power cables lying on shelves along the walls. The air was heavy, stuffy, with the sour taste of insulation. The gas analyzer showed normal levels. Leoshka followed, and we continued on. The duct ran straight ahead, without any turns, with a slight downward slope. Our footsteps echoed loudly on the concrete floor. Every 20 meters, dead lamps hung from the ceiling in latticed shades, shrouded in gray dust. No one had turned on the light here for probably 30 years. At the 180-meter, as I counted my steps, the collector ran into a wall. But to the right was a door, steel without a handle, its paint peeling, once green. Leoshka took a crowbar from his backpack and inserted it into the crack. The door gave way with a drawn-out screech that made my jaw clench. "What's there?" "I don't know yet, but let's take a look." The collector ended, and we entered a tunnel. The walls here were cast iron tubes, typical of the subway's rings, but uneven, streaked with rust, red and brown. Dirt had packed in between the tubes, and in places, moisture was visible. Underfoot, there were sleepers, wooden, rotted black, and between them stood water, 10 centimeters of murky liquid. The rails were missing. They had apparently been removed long ago. "There it is," whispered Leoshka, his voice trembling with delight, not fear. Still with delight. "The cut of the 38th. I aimed the beam of my headlamp deeper. The tunnel stretched ahead and curved slightly to the right, disappearing around a gentle bend. The air was different, thick, still, with the smell of wet iron and something else I didn't immediately name. Eventually, though, I did. It's the smell of earth when you dig a deep hole. Soil, clay, something like that. Gas analyzer. Normal. Oxygen, 19.8. Methane, 0. We continued on. The cut turned out to be longer than Grandpa Vasily had said. We went 120 meters, then another 50, then another. The tunnel never ended. The tubes became less dense. In some places, the walls merged into bare rock, reinforced with wooden supports. The logs were blackened, swollen. Some had cracked and stuck out like splinters. "This isn't a cut," I remarked, stopping. "This is a full-fledged tunnel, hundreds of meters here. Maybe a geological exploration at it?" Leoshka turned his head, sweeping the beam along the walls. "The 30s, looking for a deep-laid route." "Maybe." I looked at my watch. 2:45. We had until 4:30. Then the track workers would begin their inspection before launch. There was plenty of time. I nodded, and we continued on. At 200 meters, my brother stopped. "Do you hear that?" he asked. I froze. I listened. Nothing. The silence of the dungeon. Absolute. Cottony. The kind of silence where you can hear your own pulse in your ears and the soft whistle of your breath in your nose. "No." "What?" "Like a knock, far ahead." I listened again, and heard it. Not a knock. More like a rhythmic tapping, very distant, very faint, like someone slapping a hand against the wall, at regular intervals. Once every 3 seconds. A drip, I guessed. A drip isn't rhythmic. He was right. But I really didn't want him to be right. We walked on, and with each step the sound grew clearer. It wasn't a drip. It was a dull, soft thud, like a fist wrapped in a rag hitting metal. And the temperature was changing. It was about 12 degrees at the entrance, normal for deep workings. Now it was warmer. I unbuttoned the collar of my jumpsuit, ran my fingers down my neck, and felt the dampness. I was sweating profusely. At the 250-meter, the tunnel widened. We emerged into a cell, a sort of small hall, about 6 meters wide and the same height. The walls here were concrete, roughly poured, with imprints of formwork boards. Against the far wall stood an iron bed without a mattress, a rusty frame on arched legs. Nearby, an overturned stool. On the floor, a tin bowl and an aluminum mug. "What the hell?" whispered Lyoshka. I walked closer. Someone had scratched letters on the wall above the bed. I aimed the beam and read them. The inscription was in Russian, clumsy letters scratched with something sharp. "The shift has not come. Day 4. I hear them from below. Below, they are knocking. Lower down, even shallower, as if my hand were shaking. Do not open block 11. My mouth went dry. I slowly turned to face my brother. He stood at the entrance to the cell, motionless. His face was white in the beam of the flashlight, his lips pressed together. The camera on his chest blinked red. "Are we leaving?" he asked. I wanted to say yes. I should have said yes. But in the far wall of the cell, I saw another passage, low, no more than 5 feet high, and from there came that same knocking sound. Now it was loud, distinct, rhythmic, like a metronome. And from there came a warmth, damp, thick, like a steam room. I pointed the beam down the passage. The tunnel continued, but it was now very narrow. The walls were covered with a whitish coating, similar to efflorescence, but thicker, looser, like mold. And I noticed something else. There were footprints in the dirt on the floor. No, not ours. Bare feet, many, overlapping. Someone had walked here. Someone had walked here a lot. "Lyosha," I pointed quietly. "Footprints." He came over, crouched, looked. Then he looked at me, and I saw in his eyes something he would never have said out loud. Fear was there. "They're about 50 years old," he said, his voice even, barely controlled. "Dried. The clay has hardened." I looked closer. He was right. The footprints were petrified, pressed into the clay floor, which had dried and hardened to the consistency of stone. "Then who's knocking?" I asked. The moment I said those words, the knocking stopped. Silence fell upon us like an avalanche. We stood motionless, 2 grown men in protective suits, with flashlights, radios, and crowbars, afraid to breathe. And then from the low passage came a sound I will never forget for the rest of my life. A whisper. Not a word, not a phrase, just a whisper, as if dozens of voices were simultaneously exhaling something unintelligible. It lasted a second, maybe 2, then it fell silent. And again, after a pause, exhalation, whisper, silence, exhalation, whisper, silence. In the same rhythm as the knocking, Lyoshka grabbed my hand. His fingers were icy and clammy. He turned and walked back, quickly, almost running, and I followed him without looking back. We walked along the tunnel, our footsteps thundering and echoing, and it seemed as if someone else was walking behind us, but I didn't turn around. I looked at Lyosha's back, at his backpack bouncing with every step, and counted the meters. At the 150-meter mark, halfway to the exit, my headlamp flickered. I had time to think. The battery couldn't have been charged yesterday, and the headlamp went out. I stopped, and at the same second, Lyosha's went out. Darkness. No, not at all the darkness you get used to in a room with the lights off. Underground darkness, absolute, physical, in which the eyes don't adapt because there's nothing to adapt to. Not a single photon. Nothing. Lyosha. I'm here. The spare. I heard him fumbling with the backpack, the snap of the carabiner, the rustle of fabric, then his voice, quiet and muffled. Anton, the backup won't turn on. I reached into my backpack. I found the backup Phoenix and pressed the button. Nothing. I pressed it again. Nothing. The battery was still there. I'd checked it before leaving, and the indicator showed full charge. "The radio," said Lyoshka. I pressed the Baofeng's push-to-talk button. The screen didn't light up. The radio was dead. Phone. I pulled my smartphone out of my breast pocket. The screen didn't respond. The power button, holding it down, nothing. The glass was warm, almost hot. "Me too!" Lyoshka's voice trembled. "Everything's dead. Everything! We stood in complete darkness, 200 meters below Vozvijenka, without a single source of light, no communication, no navigation. And then I heard it again. The whisper. It was closer. Much closer. Lyoshka felt my hand, and squeezed it so hard I felt my knuckles crack. I squeezed back. We stood in the darkness, and the whisper grew closer, and with it the damp heat grew, and the smell of deep soil, and something else, sweetish, nauseating. And then I saw. Not with my eyes. I still don't know how to explain it. My eyes were open, and the darkness was the same, but I could see, as if the image was projected directly into my brain, bypassing my vision. A corridor. Narrow, low, descending, deeper and deeper, toward something that had always been below, long before the metro, before Moscow, before everything. And in the walls of this corridor, embedded in the rock, were faces. Dozens of faces. Open mouths, empty eye sockets, distorted by a grimace that could have been a scream or could have been something else. And they were moving. Lips moving, pronouncing the same word, over and over without a sound. No, with a sound. That was that whisper. They said, 11th? I screamed. Or Lyoshka screamed. Or both of us. I don't remember. I remember that we were running, in complete darkness, knee-deep in water, stumbling over rotted railroad ties, holding hands like children. I remember hitting my helmet on the edge of the tubing and losing my bearings for a second. I remember Lyoshka pulling me forward, and I could hear his breathing. Ragged, hoarse, whistling, like an asthmatic. And then the headlamp turned on, just like that. No click, no button. The beam hit the wall, and I saw the concrete of the cable duct. We were at the door. We were at the exit. Lyoshka yanked the door, and we tumbled into the duct, and he slammed it behind us, leaning back and bracing himself with his feet. His headlamp was also on. The radio, which he had switched on automatically, hissed with static. Alive. We sat on the concrete floor of the cable duct, our backs against the steel door, and were silent for about 10 minutes. Then I looked at Lyoshka. His face was wet and gray. His eyes widened so much that the whites were clearly visible. A bruise was swelling on his left temple, under his helmet. "Did you see it?" I asked. He nodded. Slowly. "Once." "Faces," he muttered. "In the walls." 11, I added. He closed his eyes and clenched his fists. We climbed out through the same hatch on Vozvijenka. It was 4 in the morning. The city was empty, clean, indifferent. The streetlights glowed with a steady sodium light. Somewhere in the distance, a street sprinkler passed. I later tried to find information about Block 11. I dug through the Metrostroy archives, which are publicly available. I found little. Documents from 1938 mentioned section number 11 on the deep-level Arbatsky radius route. The tunneling was halted due to unfavorable hydrogeological conditions. 5 workers, a team of miners, were listed as missing, not dead. Missing. Their bodies were never found. The case was closed in 1939 with the explanation, an industrial accident. I found Grandfather Vasily a week after our foray. I went to see him in Liublino. He was sitting in a chair by the window, small and withered, his hands covered in age spots. When I said Block 11, he paused for a long moment. Then he turned to face me, and I saw that his eyes were wet. "You fool," he said. "Why did you go in there? What's going on, Vasily Petrovich?" He shook his head. "I don't know. We were digging a parallel tunnel in 52 for Arbatsko-Pokrovskaya. We passed by. Our foreman, Seryoga Klopov, found a way in and poked his head in. He returned an hour later. Gray-haired. He was 32 years old, but he came back gray-haired, and his hands shook for the rest of his short life. He didn't say anything. He just said, 'Don't go to number 11. What did he see there?" "I told you. I didn't tell you. He started drinking. 3 years later, he died." "Heart." Grandfather paused. Then he added quietly, almost to himself, Moscow stands on bones. Everyone knows that. But bones are what's above and below. He didn't finish. He closed his eyes. I sat for another 5 minutes and left. Lyosha's camera, a GoPro, recorded the entire expedition. We watched it together the next day, at my house, with the lights on, the curtains drawn because the screen was glaring. Everything was there. The sewer, the door, the tunnel, the cell with the bed, the writing on the wall. The knocking was also audible in the recording. Dull. Measured. And then, where we heard the whisper, the recording cut out. Not with static, not with a black screen. The image froze on one frame, a clear picture of the tunnel wall, and didn't move. The sound continued. 37 seconds of sound without a picture. A whisper. Our scream. Footsteps. The splash of water. And then, suddenly, another image. The cable duct. The door. Our hands. Lyoshka erased 37 seconds. I didn't argue, but before I did, I listened to them on headphones, alone, at night, after my brother had left. I listened to them on slow motion. It wasn't 11. They said, "Let me in." Lyoshka sold his gear after 2 weeks. I continued a descent, but only along familiar routes. Neglinka, Filevskaya, the drainage near the library. Safe, well-trodden, boring. I returned to the door in the cable duct on Vozdvijenka only once, in November. There was no door. A wall. A solid concrete wall, seamless, without a trace of dismantling, as if the door had never existed. A year has passed. A whole year, and I'd almost convinced myself I could leave it all behind. Almost. Because there's a difference between forgetting and stopping thinking about it every day. I hadn't forgotten. But I'd learned to fall asleep without the light on, stopped testing the bathroom walls before turning off the water, and even returned to regular outings, though only along the old routes. Neglinka, Filevskaya, the drainage. Familiar, understandable. Safe. Something that couldn't surprise. Lyoshka worked as a courier, riding his bike around Kuntsevo, and kept quiet. We saw each other once every 2 weeks. We'd drink coffee in the kitchen, talking about anything but that very thing. He'd lost weight, becoming sinewy from pedaling, and his gaze had become calm, even without its former shine. Like a man who'd undergone major surgery and decided to simply move on with his life, without asking questions. I wasn't planning on going back there. I wasn't planning on telling anyone. But in early October, at Rusik's apartment, after 5 cans of craft beer, his tongue loosened. Rusik, Ruslan Kadyrov, was one of us. Not exactly a digger, more of a sympathizer. He walked along Neglinka with us a couple of times, filming on his phone, posting stories. He liked the atmosphere itself, the streetlights in the dark, the echo, the drips. But he didn't venture further than the drainage sewers. Diamond, Dmitry Sotnikov, was much more serious. A former industrial climber, he worked at high-rise buildings, knew ropes professionally, and had been going underground for about 5 years, though less often than Lyoshka and I. He was sturdy, silent, with a short haircut and a habit of double-checking everything. While Rusik was the type to drunkenly climb a fence for fun, Dimon would first check for barbed wire, then figure out an escape route, and only then would he climb. We were sitting in Rusik's kitchen in a Khrushchev-era building on Molodyoznaya Street. The kitchen was cramped, the linoleum bulging at the threshold, and a bare lamp above the table. Rusik was pouring beer into mugs. Dimon was twirling an unlit cigarette in his fingers, and I was chewing a crouton, unsure how to begin. But the beer was already simmering in my head, and the words just flowed. I told him everything, from the very beginning. Grandpa Vasily's diagram, the hatch on Vozdvijenka, the cable duct, the door, the cut, the cell with the bed, the sign, the knock, the whisper, the darkness. 37 seconds of recording. Let me in, and how the door had vanished when I arrived in November. While I was talking, Rusik listened with his mouth slightly open and forgot to drink. Daimon's expression didn't change. Only the cigarette in his fingers spun faster and faster, back and forth, back and forth. So, that's how it is. And when I stopped speaking, there was silence for about 10 seconds. "You're something else, Toka," Rusik breathed out. "Are you serious right now?" "Seriously. And is there a recording?" Lyoshka deleted it. His friend leaned back in his chair. He looked at Daimon. He tucked his cigarette behind his ear and steepled his fingers on the table. "Anton," he said evenly, "do you realize this sounds like complete nonsense? I understand. There's no door there. I was in that cable room on Vozdvijenka 2 years ago when they were laying cable for the construction. The wall is blank. Concrete. I know. When I came back in November, there was a wall too. So? Well, there was a door in September too. And then it disappeared." Daimon paused. Then he slowly shook his head, not denying, but rather weighing it. "Show me," Rusik asked. "Show me what?" "The location. Let's go and see. If it's a wall, then it's a wall, and you've overdone it or messed it up. If the door—" He didn't finish, but his eyes blazed with that same excitement I knew all too well. The excitement of a newbie who doesn't yet understand that underground darkness comes in different forms. "No," I shook my head. "I'm not going." "Toka, damn it. You told me yourself. Did you expect us not to ask? Nobody forced your hand." "I've had too much to drink. Forget it." Daimon looked at me carefully, his gaze long and narrow. "Anton, if what you're saying is even a quarter true, it needs to be documented. Properly. Not on a GoPro, but with proper equipment. I have a Sony Alpha. I'll get a stabilizer. I have a gas analyzer more powerful than your Draeger, an industrial one, 4-channel. I have a dosimeter. If there's an anomaly, we'll record it. There's no door, Daimon. It's gone. Then there's nothing to be afraid of. We'll get there, see the wall, have a beer, and then we'll go our separate ways. And if there's a door—" He didn't smile. He spoke calmly, matter-of-factly, as if it were a work trip. "They tried to persuade me for 3 evenings. Rusik called every day, sending links to digger forums where they discussed abandoned sites in the Arbat area. Daimon sent a list of his gear and asked my boot size in case mine were worn out. I kept quiet, citing being busy, saying I didn't want to. And every night as I was falling asleep, I saw that cell, the bed, the sign, 'Do not open block 11. And I woke up wondering, what was beyond that low passage? Where did that corridor lead? The one Lyoshka and I didn't go down. We turned around when the whispers started. We ran back. But the passage continued further, downwards, and there was something else there. I knew I shouldn't. And yet, on the 4th evening, I called Rusik and said, Saturday, 2 in the morning. Fragment 1. Conversation with Lyoshka. I called Lyoshka on Wednesday, 3 days before the expedition. I couldn't help but call. We'd been hiking together for 10 years, and dragging strangers into that clearing without his knowledge would have been wrong. Besides, I'd hoped he'd go. Foolishly so. He arrived that evening, after his shift, wearing a courier windbreaker with a logo on the back, holding a bike helmet. He sat in the kitchen, pushed the mugs together with a practiced motion, and placed the helmet on the table. I poured him some tea. He cupped the mug with both hands, and I noticed his hands were tanned, dry, and calloused from the handlebars, the hands of a man who spends his days outdoors. Lyosha, I want to go somewhere. To Vozdvijenka. He didn't flinch. He didn't look up. He simply stopped blowing on his tea. His fingers froze on the mug. Where exactly? He said evenly, and it wasn't a question. There. Rusik and Daimon Sotnikov are asking to go. I told them. I drank too much, let it slip. Now they won't leave me alone. He set the mug down. Slowly, carefully, precisely in the center of the tea stain on the oilcloth. He looked at me. His eyes were calm, clear, without reproach. Worse than reproach. Patience was visible in them. Anton, yes. There's no door. You checked it yourself in November. A wall. I know, most likely nothing will happen. Most likely. He paused. Then he said, and if it does? I didn't answer. And he didn't expect an answer. For 6 months, he began, then faltered. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, gathering his thoughts. For 6 months, I woke up to the sound of someone standing in the room. Every night, Anton, I open my eyes. It's dark, and there's someone in the corner. I can't see it, but I know it. I feel it. I lie there, unable to move. For a minute, 2, 5. Then it eases. I turn on the light, and there's no one. It only passed by spring. By March, he spoke without emotion, without self-pity. He was stating the truth. I didn't sell all my gear because I lost interest. I still dream about the subway. To this day, when I ride past a ventilation shaft on my bike, I slow down and listen to the hum coming from there. It didn't work, but I made a choice. I decided I didn't want to know what happened next. I'd had enough. Do you understand? What I'd already seen was enough for me. I understand. No, he shook his head. You don't understand. Because if you did, you wouldn't be taking Rusik there now. Rusik, Anton. He's been down the Neglinka twice in his life, both times. And both times he was sickened by the smell. He doesn't know what the underground is. The real thing. He thinks it's an adventure, a ride. Diamond's experienced. Diamond's an industrial climber. He knows how to hang on a rope. He doesn't know when to leave. That's different. He fell silent and picked up his mug again. He took a sip. He put it down. He looked out the window, where the lights of Kuntsevo glowed through the glass, yellow, orange, the homely glow. Will you come with me? I asked. No, one word. Without hesitation, without pause, like a door that's been closed and welded shut. Leosha. No, Anton. I won't go back there. Never. And I don't advise you to either. But you're a grown man, and I won't keep you. I'll just say one thing. He stood up, taking the helmet from the table. He turned to me already at the kitchen door. What we heard in the dark, remember? When everything went dark. The whispers. I remember. They said, let me in. That means they're inside. That means there's something between them and us. A wall, a door, a partition. Something's holding them back. And every time someone comes down and opens that door, they make the gap wider. Think about it. He put on the helmet, clicked the clasp, and left. I heard the front door slam, then the screeching of wheels on the landing, then silence. I sat in the kitchen and thought about the gap, about how the door had been closed last time, and now, if it ever reappears, it might be open. About how each visit changes the rules slightly. And then I took out my phone and texted Rusik. Saturday. No change. The calculation seemed simple. The door disappeared in November. A year had passed. Most likely the wall was still there. We'd wait. Rusik would take some pictures of the concrete with his phone. Diamond would check with his equipment. And we'd leave. I was even glad of this option, because it would mean it was all over. Whatever was behind that passage had closed, and we could move on. But I had a feeling, sticky and tugging, like wet cloth on my back, that the door would be there, that it was waiting, or what was beyond it awaits. Saturday, October 12th. We met at my place in Kuntsevo at 11 o'clock in the evening. Rusik arrived by taxi, carrying a backpack with sneakers and a raincoat dangling from it. I looked at his feet. Are you wearing sneakers? What? Are you crazy? There's water there. Mud. Knee-deep in places. You'll get soaked in the first 5 minutes, and then you'll be splashing and freezing. I don't have any boots. I got a pair of spare waders from the closet. Leoshka's, size 103. Rusik wore a 102, but with thick socks it worked. He pulled them on and strolled down the hallway, looking ridiculous with his high rubber boots under his jeans. Diamond walked, as he lived 2 houses away. His backpack was packed military style, tightly and compactly, each item in its own compartment. A Tyvek suit, a helmet with a headlamp mount, 2 Phoenix cameras, 1 primary and 1 backup, a Baofeng UV5R radio, a BW Gas Alert Micro 5 gas analyzer, a Red X dosimeter, a Sony camera in a protective case, a first aid kit, a knife, an Alyonka chocolate bar, and a canteen of water. He hung the rope and carabiners on his belt. A fucking professional. We got dressed, checked our gear, and set off. We were driving in my car. Moscow nighttime glided past the windows, streetlights, empty sidewalks, closed stalls. Rusik was silent in the back seat, fiddling with his headlamp and clicking the power button. Click, click, click. "Stop it," Demon asked, without turning around. My friend froze. He muttered quietly, "Sorry. I'm nervous." "It's fine," Demon nodded, "but don't drain the battery." We parked 2 blocks from Vozdvizenka on a quiet side street and continued on foot. The construction site was still there, the same corrugated metal sheets. Blue, only the ads had been updated. Someone had screwed the screw back into the sheet metal through which Lyoshka and I had crawled. Diamond took out his multi-tool and unscrewed it in 30 seconds. The sheet folded back, and we squeezed through. The site had changed. The trailers had been moved, and an excavator had appeared, a yellow Komatsu, dusted with dust, with its bucket lowered. A cement mixer stood nearby. I led the guys past the equipment to the far edge, where a hatch was hidden behind a pile of rubble. It was there. A cast-iron lid with the letters Mozenergo had been moved, covered not by plywood, but by a piece of roofing felt weighed down by a brick. I removed the brick and pushed back the roofing felt. A black hole peered upward. "Go first," Diamond said, and climbed in. I followed. Rusik was last. The clamps were rusty. The third one from the bottom was loose. I warned Rusik, and he carefully grabbed hold. We got down safely. Now, in that direction. Cable manifold. Same old story. A rectangular concrete passage, cables on shelves, dead lamps. The air was heavy and sour. Diamond took out the gas analyzer, waited for it to warm up, and then looked at the display. Oxygen 19.6, methane 0, hydrogen sulfide 0, clear. "Let's go," I nodded. We started walking. I led the way. Diamond behind me, Rusik bringing up the rear. Our footsteps were resonant and rhythmic. The beams of the flashlights bounced along the walls, picking out cables, cracks, and streaks of rust. Rusik turned his head, taking pictures with his phone. "It's a bit dark in here," his comrade complained. "It's too dark." "The recording won't be particularly." "Were you expecting anything else?" At the 180-meter mark, I stopped. The beam hit a wall, a dead end. To the right, a door. Steel, without a handle, with peeling green paint, rusty streaks all over its surface. Ajar. A 2-finger-wide crack from which a warm air blew, smelling of wet iron and deep soil. Ajar. Last time, Lyoshka and I had pried it open with a crowbar. Now it stood there, as if someone had pushed it from the inside and left it there. Or as if it was waiting. I froze. My fingers clenched on the handle of the crowbar, my knuckles whitened. My calculation, that same dull, cozy calculation against a blank wall, crumbled like ash. Demon came close. He ran the beam along the door leaf, along the hinges, along the frame. He touched the edge. The metal was real, cold, rough with corrosion. "Anton," he said quietly, "you said there was a wall here in November." "There was. Solid. Seamless. I checked." He paused. He shone the light through the crack. The beam fell into the darkness beyond the door and dissipated, meeting nothing in the distance. Well, Rusik breathed. He hovered behind us, looking at the door, the way someone watches a magician's trick, where a coin disappears in a fist, with disbelief already tinged with anxiety. "Diamond, you said there was a wall here, that you were there yourself." "You were there," he confirmed. His voice was even, but he stood very still, and I noticed his hand, the one holding the gas analyzer, turned slightly white at the knuckles. 2 years ago, concrete, no door. And then what? Diamond didn't answer. He looked at the door, and I could see his brain working behind his narrowed eyes, running through the possibilities, trying to fit what he saw into a rational framework. And he couldn't. Was it open? He asked me. No. Last time we used a crowbar. It was closed tightly. And now it's ajar. Yes. He turned and looked me in the face. In the light of the flashlight, his pupils were small, focused. Are we going or not? I should have said no. Every cell in my body, every ounce of experience, every memory of that night with Leoshka screamed no. But the door was open. It didn't just exist despite everything. It stood practically wide open, like an invitation. Or like a maw. Let's go, I finally sighed. But if I say back, we turn around without further ado, without discussion, immediately. Daimon nodded. Rusik swallowed and nodded too. I pushed the door. It swung open silently. The hinges didn't creak, though the last time they'd creaked so loudly it was jaw-wrenching. Silently, smoothly, like oiled hinges. We stepped inside. The tunnel remained the same. Cast-iron tunnel tubes, rust, black railroad ties, water underfoot. Rusik slipped on the third step, grabbed the wall, and jerked his hand back. His fingers were smeared with red slime. Oh my God, this is crap. Don't touch the walls, I advised. The tubes are slippery. Dimon walked silently, puffing under his breath. The Sony camera hung around his neck. He periodically lifted it and took it off. He carried the gas analyzer in his hand, glancing at the display every half-minute. We walked the 200 meters to the tunnel in about 7 minutes. Rusik had quieted down by then, stopped turning his head, and was following me closely, as instructed. His breathing had become rapid and shallow, but he didn't complain. The cell. The same room, 6 by 6, concrete walls with imprints of boards, an iron bed, a stool, a bowl, a mug. Everything in place. Everything was perfect. I pointed the beam at the wall above the bed. The writing was still there. The shift has not come. Day 4. I hear them from below. They are knocking. Do not open block 11. Rusik came closer. He read it. He turned to me, his face already losing its cheerful excitement, revealing something sharper underneath. It's real, he said, his voice wavering on the last syllable. It's real. Diamond took close-up photos of the inscriptions. Then he crouched down and shone the light under the bed. There lay a rag, shapeless and blackened by age, in which the outline of a work uniform could be discerned. A padded jacket, rotted to the point of translucency. The 30s, he said thoughtfully. Probably a miner. Lived here. Was on duty. We milled about for a few more minutes. Rusik photographed the inscription, the bowl, and the bed. Diamond checked the gas analyzer. Oxygen levels were 19.2, slightly lower than at the entrance, but within normal limits. The dosimeter showed a background level of 12 microrentions, typical for underground areas. And then I looked at the far wall, at that passage. Low, 1.5 meters high, with a whitish coating on the walls. Last time, Leoshka and I had turned around right here. Last time, a whisper had come from there. Now it was quiet. No knocking. No whispering. Just a drip. A real drip. Irregular, languid, coming from somewhere above. That passage, I pointed. We didn't go there. Daimon approached, crouched, and shone the light inside. The beam extended into the depths, illuminating the narrowing tunnel. The walls were covered in the same coating I'd seen last time. Thick, loose, pale. It didn't resemble efflorescence, as I'd thought then. More like something organic. A dry, spongy mass, like mycelium growing on the rock. Listen, Toka, Rusik stood behind me, his voice taut with a cheerful, tense quality, like a string being pulled a half-tone too high. Maybe we should just forget about it? We found it. Took a picture. It's enough for the story. Wait, Dimon said. He pointed the camera down the hallway and shot, slowly panning the lens from left to right. Anton, you said there were footprints on the floor? There were. Barefoot. Not now. The floor is clean." I looked closer. He was right. Last time, the clay floor had held dozens of petrified barefoot prints. Now the clay was smooth, even, damp, without a single trace, as if someone had leveled it, or as if it had grown anew, a fresh layer over the old one. I felt a chill. Not cold, no, the air was still warm, uncomfortably warm for such a depth. But it felt like my ribs had suddenly become hollow, and every heartbeat reverberated throughout my body. "Let's go," Diamond said, simply and matter-of-factly, like he'd say, "Let's go," in industrial climbing, clipping himself to the ledge on the 30th floor. I didn't argue, because I knew that if I didn't go now, I'd be thinking about it for another year. Another 2. My whole life. "Let's go." We bent down and entered the low passage. Russick was last, and I heard him muttering something under his breath, either curses or some kind of poem. The passageway stretched for about 30 meters, then the ceiling rose, and we stood up straight. The tunnel had widened, but the character of the walls had changed. The tubes were gone. Bare rock, dark, layered clay with veins of something white, like quartz. The supports were wooden, old, but here, unlike in the main tunnel, they hadn't rotted. The wood had blackened, hardened, like ebony. I even rapped the support with my knuckles, and it responded with a short, ringing click, like stone. The mycelium, if it was mycelium, covered the walls like a solid carpet. Its thickness increased with each meter, a pale, layered mass with dark spots that resembled pores. Diamond lifted a piece with his knife, and it came off with a dry crunch. Inside it was porous, like bread, and it gave off a faint odor, not unpleasant, but rather a strange, sweet, herbaceous one, like dried thyme. "Have you seen anything like this?" he asked. "No. Never." "Mushrooms don't grow like that," Russick remarked over my shoulder. "I'm a biologist by training, by the way. This isn't mycelium. It has a different structure." I didn't know Comrade was a biologist. He worked as a manager at Leroy Merlin and never mentioned his education. The tunnel sloped gently downward. The slope was slight, 3 or 4 degrees, but continuous. We'd been walking for about 15 minutes past the chamber with the bed, and I estimated we'd dropped about 12 meters below its level. That meant we were about 70 meters deep, deeper than most subway lines. Diamond's gas analyzer beeped. He looked at the screen and stopped. "Oxygen 18.2, he muttered. "Below normal. Not critical, but borderline. If it drops to 17, we turn around." I nodded. Russick nodded too, frequently and eagerly. We continued on. The tunnel made a turn, then another, and markings appeared on the walls, painted red, half erased, but still discernible. Numbers. 7, 8, 9. "Block numbers," I whispered. 10th, Diamond said as we passed another mark. The next section of the tunnel was longer, about 40 meters. The walls here were so thickly covered with mycelium that the contours of the rock were completely obscured, and it felt as if we were walking inside something living, through a cavity in someone's body. The mass slightly springed under my fingers when I accidentally touched the wall. Warm, dry to the touch, but with an internal warmth, not from the surrounding air, but its own. Russick stopped mumbling. He walked silently, and his steps sounded different, unevenly, intermittently. I turned and shone the light. My friend's face was wet, and rivulets of sweat ran down his temples. His eyes darted around. The headlamp on his helmet trembled, casting dancing shadows. "Russia, how are you?" "Fine," he managed to say, and the smile he tried to fake looked crooked and creepy. "Fine, Toka. Let's go." Diamond walked ahead, and I saw him slow down. Stopped. The beam of his flashlight hit the wall. "Dead end?" I asked. "No." I walked closer, and saw. Damn it! There was a niche in the wall, shallow, about 40 centimeters, and in it, embedded in the mycelium, ingrained, sunken to the shoulders, stood a body, A human body, upright, like an exhibit in a display case. The head was thrown back, the mouth open. The skin, if it was skin, was gray, thin, stretched tightly over the skull. The eye sockets were closed, the eyelids sunken. The body wore the remnants of clothing. It looked like a padded overall, canvas pants, boots. Clothing from the 30s. The mycelium entwined the figure. It had grown through the fabric, through the skin. White threads emerged from the nostrils, the ears, the slightly open mouth, and disappeared into the wall. The wall was part of it, and the body was part of the wall, and there was no boundary between the living and the non-living, between stone and flesh. Rusik made a sound. Not a scream, not a groan, something between them. Guttural, strangled, as if the air had been jerked from my lungs. I turned to face him, and as my beam slid across the opposite wall, I saw a second niche, and a third, and a fourth. On both sides of the tunnel, in niches like figures in a cathedral, stood bodies. 5. I counted 5. All in overalls, all in identical poses. Heads thrown back, mouths open, sprouting with mycelium. A team of miners, 5 people who disappeared in 1938. Not missing. Absorbed. "Let's go," Dimon whispered. And for the first time all evening, his voice was not calm. It was quiet and quick, like that of a man afraid that if he speaks any louder, he will lose his temper. I turned to Rusik and realized he wasn't there. Where did he go? The beam darted down the tunnel. My comrade stood about 10 meters ahead of us, beyond the line of niches, facing the wall where the number 11 was painted. Beyond that mark, the tunnel continued, and from there, from the depths, came a glow. A dim, diffused, pinkish-orange one, like the glow of coals. "Rusya!" I shouted. "Stop!" He wasn't moving. He stood there, swaying slightly, his arms at his sides, the light on his helmet blazing, but his head motionless, staring forward into the glow. I rushed toward him, grabbed his shoulder, and spun him around. His face. I remember his face. His eyes were open, wide, wider than I thought possible, and his pupils were dilated so much that the irises almost disappeared. He wasn't looking at me, but through me, somewhere beyond my head, into the distance, beyond the 11th. His mouth was slightly open, his lower lip trembling slightly. A thread of drool glistened on his chin. "Rusya," I shook him by the shoulders. "Ruslan, can you hear me?" His lips moved. He said something, so quietly I didn't hear it. I leaned closer, my ear to his mouth. "They're all here," he whispered. "They're all here. They're all here. They're all here." One phrase, repeating itself, without pause, without intonation, like a broken record. His eyes didn't blink, their gaze remaining focused on something I couldn't see and didn't want to see. "Diamond!" I shouted. My comrade was nearby, already grabbing Rusik's other arm. We turned him around so his back was to block 11 and dragged him back. And then it began. Not a sound. Not a whisper. Like last time with Lyoshka. A presence. I don't know how to describe it more accurately. The air behind him grew thicker, heavier, as if something enormous had moved in close and was breathing down his neck, warm and moist, with that same sweetish scent that suddenly became thick, unbearable, clogging his nostrils and throat. And in this presence, there was a sense of will, not malice, not hunger, something else, a cold, patient attention, like something observing and deciding whether to take or let go. Rusik didn't resist, but he didn't help either. His legs moved like a doll's, mechanically, effortlessly. His body went limp. He continued to whisper, and his whisper was even, monotonous, without pauses for breath, as if the words didn't require any air at all. "Faster," Diamond croaked. We dragged him through the tunnel, past niches with bodies, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw the lips of those figures in the walls moving. I saw it, and I knew I shouldn't look. Shouldn't stop, because if I stopped and looked straight ahead, I'd see what Russick saw, and I'd be gone. Not physically. Me. Who I am. We ran, as fast as we could, with the limp, 80-kilogram body between us, across the slippery clay, crouching under the low supports. Russick wheezed. His legs stopped moving, and we dragged him, his backpack scraping the floor, his waders gathering dirt. Diamond stumbled, fell to one knee, cursed through his teeth, and rose, still holding on to his friend. I slipped after 3 steps, fell sideways, and hit my helmet on a support post. White flashed before my eyes, and in that flash, brief as a blow, I saw them. Faces. Dozens of faces, visible through the rock, through the mycelium, through my reality, sealed off for a split second. Gray, sunken, with open mouths, with lips moving, forming the same word. Let me in. Or, let me in. Singular. They were addressing me personally. Let's go! I jumped up. I grabbed Russick. We ran on. Forward! Forward! Faster! The presence behind me didn't let up. It wasn't getting any closer. No. It was everywhere. In the walls, in the floor, in the air, in the warmth that enveloped us like water. And I understood with the clarity that comes only in moments of absolute, primal terror, that if I turned around, I would see it all. Not fragments, not flashes. In its entirety. And then I would stay here, like those miners. I would stand in the niche. I would close my eyes, and the mycelium would grow through me. But I didn't turn around, although I confess I really wanted to. I wanted to know, to uncover the secret. But there are secrets that must remain forever behind closed iron doors. A low passage. We bent over, shoved Russick in, and pushed him through the 30-meter narrowing, scraping our overalls against the walls. The mycelium crunched and crumbled beneath our bodies, falling into dry dust. That smell, sweet and herbal, was in that dust, and I held my breath until I tumbled out into the familiar cell with the bed. Here, in the cell, I tripped over a stool and fell, hitting my elbow painfully on the concrete. The flashlight flickered, and in that second of semi-darkness, I saw the face again. One, right in front of me. Not in the wall, but in the air, like a projection, like an imprint on the retina. A woman's face. Young, with an open mouth and dark sockets. It was so close that I could see individual strands of mycelium emerging from the corners of her lips. Then the flashlight flickered again, and the face disappeared. But the face didn't disappear. It remained, and others followed it, and the lantern was already burning. But I still saw them because they weren't outside. They were inside, behind closed eyelids, on the backs of my eyes, imprinted directly on my consciousness, and each lasted a split second. But that split second contained a whole life. A man in a canvas robe, his face covered in coal dust. The 30s, a pickaxe in his hands, standing in a coal face, and the wall before him throbs, and he screams. But no sound comes from his throat, only white threads. They crawl out from between his teeth like worms, and he clutches his face, and his fingers sink into the flesh of his cheeks. A woman, young, fair-haired, in a linen shirt that reaches to his heels, coarsely woven, with braid at the collar. Not the 30s, not the 20th century. Earlier, much earlier. She's kneeling. The clay beneath her is black and shiny, and her arms are up to her elbows in this clay, and she can't pull them out, and her lips are moving, and I hear. No, I know what she's saying. The earth won't let me go. The earth holds me. Oh, Mother. Oh, it won't let me go. And the clay creeps up her forearms, over her shoulders, hugging her throat like palms. But her face is calm, already calm, no longer struggling. Her eyes close, and the last thing that remains on the surface are her fingertips. White, crooked, and they slowly sink, as if into water. 2 soldiers in long-skirted greatcoats, with puttees on their legs from the 40s or late 30s. One holds the other's hand, pulls from the wall, and the hand comes out. But behind it are threads, thick as a finger. They tighten and don't let go. And the one in the wall turns his head, and his face is gone, a solid carpet of mycelium in its place. Pale, porous, and from the center of this carpet, a sound is squeezed out, low, vibrating. Not even a word, but the sensation of a word. Leave. A guy in a leather jacket, a shaved head, a thick gold chain, the 90s. He runs down the tunnel, no headlamp, a flashlight in his hand, dim, yellow, and the beam darts along the walls, and he runs and looks back, and his face is wet, twisted, his mouth stretched in a silent scream, and behind him, the floor of the tunnel rises in a wave, like the belly of a breathing animal, and he stumbles, falls. The flashlight rolls along the clay, the light spins, and in this rotation I see how the floor closes over him, like a quagmire, slowly, softly, without a splash, and the chain on his neck is the last to go, flashing in the beam of the flashlight, which burns for a few more seconds, and then goes out. An old man in a padded jacket from the 50s. He stands in front of a wall on which someone has written in chalk, Block 11, do not enter, order, number dash. The order number is erased. The old man reaches out and touches the wall, and the wall gives way, softly, like a membrane, and fingers emerge from under his palm, alien, gray, long. They grip his wrist, and he jerks back, and his sleeve rides up, and I see white threads already appearing on his forearm, under the skin, like veins. But not veins. They are moving, creeping toward his elbow. All this lasted maybe 2 seconds, maybe 3. I lay on the concrete floor of the cell with the bed and saw hundreds of years, hundreds of people. Those who descended, those who dug, those who simply fell, by accident, into a hole, a well, a crack that opened and closed according to its own laws. And now they were all there, below, in the walls, in the mycelium, in what grew and waited, patiently moving its lips. Let me in. Let me in. Let me in. Then the lantern leveled out, and the visions ended. I lay on my side, my elbow burning, and Diamond shouted behind me, "Don't stop! Running!" I stood up. We rushed through the chamber, into the main tunnel. Rails, water, tubing, 200 meters to the door. I didn't count the steps. I ran. We both ran, dragging Rusik, and the water swirled around our boots, and the echo of our steps thundered and multiplied. And in this rumble, I heard something extra, a fourth rhythm, a fifth, a sixth, as if the tunnel answered us with steps that did not belong to either of us. Diamond fell. I heard a splash, a curse, the clang of metal, and the camera hit the tubing. Rusik toppled over. I rushed back, grabbed Diamond by the strap of his backpack, and pulled him to his feet. His face, bathed in the light of my flashlight, was wet and distorted, his eyes quick and wild. He saw it too. I could tell by his eyes, by the way he shook his head, quickly, jerkily, shaking something off, like a dog shaking off water. We picked Rusik up. We dragged him on. 100 meters, 50, 20. The door, a steel rectangle, green paint, rust. We tumbled over the threshold, and the second my feet hit the concrete floor of the cable collector, everything stopped. Suddenly, as if cut off. The warmth gave way to the usual underground chill. The smell vanished. The presence behind me slammed shut like a closed book. The air became just air, stale, sour, with the taste of cable insulation. I turned around, hunted. For the first time in a while, I turned around. Beyond the door stretched a tunnel, empty, dark, ordinary. Rusty tubing, black water, dead railroad ties. Nothing. Diamond leaned against the door and slammed it. The clanking echoed through the sewer and died away. That's it. We lowered Rusik to the floor. He sat up, leaning against the wall, his head on his chest, his hands hanging limply in his lap. He was breathing, evenly, rhythmically. His eyes were closed. Ruslan. Dimon crouched down in front of him, shining the flashlight into his face and carefully lifting his eyelid. The pupil was huge and black, taking up almost the entire eye. He didn't react to the light. Rusya. I patted his cheek. Can you hear me? Nothing. Breathing. Pulse. But no reaction. It was as if the man had engaged autopilot and retreated somewhere within himself, to a place where no voices, no clapping, no nothing could be heard. Let's get him up, Dimon ordered. We'll call an ambulance from the car. We lifted him, and then Rusik opened his eyes. He looked at me. His gaze was meaningful, clear, but empty, like a window behind which the lights have been turned off. He opened his mouth and spoke clearly, distinctly, each word like a separate stone. There aren't 5 of them. There are hundreds. And he closed his eyes again. We pulled him out through the hatch. Diamond climbed first, and I helped Rusik up from below, tying a rope around his arms. He wasn't helping, hanging on the rope like a sack. Diamond pulled him up, and I followed. A construction site, an excavator, corrugated metal sheets. The sky was already turning gray in the east. It was about 4. We dragged him to the car. We put him in the back seat. I called an ambulance, gave him the address, and said, "Loss of consciousness, unresponsive." The dispatcher asked if the victim had taken anything. I said no. She told us to wait. While we waited, Diamond sat on the curb next to the car, a cigarette in his mouth, his hands on his knees. He was silent for about 5 minutes. Then, looking at the asphalt, he said, "I saw it too, when he fell." I didn't answer. I waited. I saw everything. Faces. In the walls. In the air. Everywhere. They were moving their mouths. Yes. And I felt it. Behind me. Like something was standing right behind me. Watching. And if you turn around... He didn't finish. He inhaled so deeply that the cigarette crackled, and the tip glowed bright orange, like the glow from Block 11. He looked at the flame, quickly stubbed it out on the sole of his shoe, and tossed it aside. "If you turn around, you'll stay," I finished for him. He nodded. The ambulance arrived 12 minutes later. They examined Rusik, shone a light into his eyes, and checked his reflexes. His pupils were unresponsive. His blood pressure was 100/60. His pulse was 48. Bradycardiac. They took him away. My friend was discharged from Scliff after 3 weeks. The diagnosis, acute polymorphic psychotic disorder. He didn't recognize us. He didn't recognize his mother. He could sit for hours, staring into space, and sometimes his lips would move silently, like those faces in the walls. A month later, his mother transferred him to a psychiatric clinic outside Moscow. He's still there. I visited him twice. The second time, he looked at me and said clearly, calmly, "They're growing up, Toka. Slowly. But they're growing. Someday they'll grow up." He didn't say anything else. Dimon left Moscow. He went to Novosibirsk to stay with relatives. He works in construction and lives in a rented apartment. We correspond once a month, briefly, to the point. He doesn't mention the subway. I don't either. But one day, in November, he sent a 1-word message. "I see." I wrote back, "Faces?" He replied, "Before bed, when I close my eyes, every night." We never spoke about it again. I returned to Vozdvijenka a week after Rusik's hospitalization, alone, during the day, without gear. Just to look. The construction site was fenced off, and a new lock hung on the gate. I peered through a crack in the corrugated sheet metal. The hatch was gone. In its place lay a fresh concrete slab, poured smoothly, neatly, with rebar studs. Someone sealed the entrance, flashed through my mind. Someone who knew about it. Or maybe not someone. It closed itself, as it always did. It healed. It healed. Like a wound in skin that grows over with new tissue, concealing what's inside. I stood by the fence and thought about Grandfather Vasily's words. Moscow stands on bones, but bones are what's on top. And below. He didn't finish then. Now I know what's down there. It's alive. It's patient. It feeds on those who descend too deep. The miners of 38 became part of it. Team leader Seryoga Klopov peered in and was burned from the inside, until his hair was gray, until his hands trembled. Lyoshka saw a shadow and abandoned everything. Rusik looked into the glow of Block 11 and never returned. There aren't 5 of them. There are hundreds. He said so. And I believe him. Because in those seconds, when faces flashed before my eyes, there were many of them. Far more than 5. Different faces, from different eras. In overalls, in greatcoats, in clothes I couldn't recognize. For centuries. It has been collecting them for centuries. I don't go down anymore. I sold my gear, like Lyoshka. I got a job with a delivery service, driving around the city, looking at the asphalt and trying not to think about what's underneath. True, sometimes, driving through the center, along Vozdvijenka, along Arbat, I feel warmth rising from underground through the subway ventilation grates. Everyone feels it, but they think it's from the trains. It's not from the trains. And before bed, when I close my eyes, I sometimes see that woman's face. Young, with dark hollows where eyes should be, with strands of mycelium at the corners of her lips. Her lips move, and I know what she's saying, the same thing they all say. Let me in. I open my eyes and lie in the darkness, and I listen. The silence in the apartment, the hum of the city outside the window, and somewhere far below, at the very edge of hearing, beyond what a person can consciously discern, but what the body feels and remembers, a steady, patient, endless beat.